The shoguns ate from lacquered trays. The nobles had grilled fish, clear broths, carefully arranged vegetables on ceramic dishes imported from China. And the farmers, who grew all of it, they ate barley porridge before dawn and went back to work. But here's the thing about cooking under constraint. It tends to produce something remarkable. The people with the least to work with figured out fermentation, preservation, and flavor long before anyone wrote it down in a cookbook. Today, we're counting down the 15 forgotten poor man dishes of feudal Japan, the food that actually fed the country, even when the country wasn't paying attention. Dish 15. Mugigayu, barley porridge. Let's start with the one that was basically the face of peasant Japan. Mugigayu, or barley porridge, was the daily bread of the Japanese common people for centuries. While white rice was being handed over to feudal lords as tax payment, the farmers who grew it were left cooking barley and millet into a thick, soupy porridge over an open fire. The Tokugawa shogunate, which ruled Japan for over 250 years during the Edo period, from 1603 to 1868, actively encouraged peasants to eat lesser grains. Barley, millet, and buckwheat were considered inferior to polished white rice, which made them, in the eyes of the ruling class, perfectly appropriate for the lower orders. What the ruling class probably didn't appreciate is that barley porridge, cooked low and slow with a handful of herbs, is actually quite filling and nutritionally solid. It kept entire villages alive through harsh winters. Every region had its own spin on it. Some added mountain greens, others stirred in wild roots or whatever happened to be available. In the northern prefectures, where winters were brutal and long, mugigayu was sometimes the only hot food a household would eat for weeks at a stretch. The herbs and scraps that went into the pot varied by what could be foraged: parsley, wild ginger, fennel growing along a field's edge. Peasants knew their local plants the way a modern person knows a grocery store. That knowledge wasn't quaint. It was survival. Simple? Absolutely. But it was the kind of simple that kept people on their feet for another day of backbreaking farm labor. You don't forget a dish like that. Dish 14. Katmeshi, the everything but rice bowl. Katmeshi is one of those dishes that tells you everything you need to know about how Japanese peasants approached food. Waste nothing, stretch everything, and make it work. The name loosely translates to something like mixed rice, but calling it that is a bit misleading, because for most of feudal Japan, actual rice was the luxury ingredient in the pot, not the base. A typical katmeshi contained whatever grain was available: barley, foxtail millet, barnyard millet, mixed with chopped daikon radish, its leaves, and anything else the household had on hand. In coastal areas, people added edible seaweed like hijiki or wakame. In the mountains, it might be taro or sweet potato. In some regions, okara, the pulpy byproduct left over from making tofu, was stirred in to bulk things up. The dish persisted well into the Meiji and Taisho periods, because poverty doesn't disappear just because a calendar flips to a new era. There's a quiet dignity to katameshi. It was never glamorous. It was never meant to be. It was meant to fill a belly before sunrise so a farmer could go out and do it all again. Dish 13. Natto, fermented soybeans. Here's one that's still very much alive today and still divides people just as sharply as it always did. Natto is fermented soybeans. Sticky, stringy, pungent, and an acquired taste by any honest measure. But in feudal Japan, it wasn't a quirky breakfast food. It was protein when protein was hard to come by. The most widely accepted origin story places natto's discovery somewhere around the late Heian or early Kamakura period, roughly the 11th to 12th centuries. Soybeans were accidentally left wrapped in rice straw, which harbors the bacterium Bacillus subtilis, and the fermentation happened naturally. What came out of that straw was something that smelled odd, looked strange, and tasted unlike anything else. But it was nourishing and it kept. Natto was fermented, which meant it didn't spoil quickly. For a peasant household with no way to refrigerate food and very little money to spend at a market, that was worth more than any fancy recipe. It became a fixture of the morning meal in eastern Japan particularly, eaten over whatever grain porridge was in the pot, sometimes with a dash of soy sauce. By the Edo period, natto vendors were already part of the fabric of early morning street life. The Edo townsperson's day reportedly started with the call of street sellers, natto, clams, vegetables, before sunrise. Working families bought their morning protein from a man walking past their row house with a basket. No kitchen required. Today, natto is something of a national test. Either you grew up eating it and find it deeply comforting, or you encounter it for the first time as an adult and make a face that's become something of a cultural institution. But back in feudal Japan, nobody was making faces. They were grateful. Dish 12. Tsukemono, salt pickled vegetables. Before anyone had a refrigerator, before anyone had a cellar full of canned goods, the people of feudal Japan had salt and patience. And from those two things, they made tsukemono, pickled vegetables, and they made them brilliantly. Tsukemono isn't one dish so much as an entire category of preservation. Daikon radish packed in salt brine, plums cured into umeboshi, cucumbers pressed under weights with rice bran. Whatever vegetables the season offered, peasants found a way to preserve them for the lean months ahead. The pickling process, which relies on lactic acid fermentation, was understood through practice long before anyone knew the science behind it. Pickled vegetables weren't a side dish in feudal Japan. They were often the entire side of the meal. You had your grain porridge, you had your miso soup, and you had your tsukemono. That was a full meal for the average farming family. The taste is sharp, tangy, sometimes almost briny. Nothing like the delicate flavors of court cuisine. But that punch of salt and acid made plain grain porridge bearable, and it did so for centuries. Takuan, pickled daikon radish, was supposedly named after the Zen Buddhist monk Takuan Soho, though the story is likely apocryphal. What isn't apocryphal is that dried and brined daikon appeared in the food records of ordinary Japanese households going back several centuries, and that farmers prepared it in autumn to last through the cold months when fresh vegetables weren't an option. You can still smell takuan being sold in Japanese markets today. It's a smell that travels straight back through time. Dish 11, miso soup, the peasant's salvation. Miso is one of those things that started out as a luxury and gradually became the most democratic food in Japan. During the Heian period, miso paste was rare and expensive, something the nobility and higher-ranking samurai had access to. By the Sengoku era, the period of civil wars running roughly from the mid-1400s to the early 1600s, salt production had expanded enough that miso spread to ordinary households. Peasant miso soup was not the elegant, carefully balanced bowl you might find at a ryokan today. It was a pot of hot water, a spoonful of fermented soybean paste, and whatever greens or root vegetables were available. Burdock, daikon tops, dried seaweed, sometimes a bit of tofu. The whole thing could be on the fire and ready in minutes. It provided warmth, salt, and a degree of protein. Soldiers carried blocks of solid miso into battle as portable nutrition. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the first shogun of the Edo period, reportedly credited his success in part to hacho miso, a darker, denser variety from the Mikawa region. Even the powerful knew this soup worked. For ordinary families, a pot of miso soup was the reliable constant of the day. The things added to it varied. The soup itself never went away. Dish 10, okara, the soybean lees. Okara is what's left after you've pressed soybeans to make tofu. It's a pale, crumbly, slightly grainy pulp, and in feudal Japan, you did not throw it out. Not when food was this precious. By itself, okara has very little flavor. But it's filling, it has some protein, and it can be cooked down with soy sauce, a bit of mirin, vegetables, and dried fish to make something that actually tastes like a proper side dish. Called unohana, when prepared this way, it was a common fixture in lower-class households and temple kitchens alike. Buddhist monks, who followed strict vegetarian principles under Shojin Ryori, devotional cuisine, found okara particularly useful because it stretched their limited pantry without requiring any animal product. Peasants found it useful for exactly the same reason, but without the philosophy attached. Tofu makers in villages and towns sold okara cheaply or gave it away. It was the residue of a process, the thing left over after the valuable product had been extracted. And yet, households all over Japan figured out how to turn it into a meal. That's not thrift, that's ingenuity. Dish 9, soba, buckwheat noodles of the common people. Soba today is associated with the Edo period food culture of urban Japan. Roadside stands, quick lunches, the clatter of wooden bowls. But its roots go deeper, and the story of soba begins not with noodle makers in city alleyways, but with mountain farmers who couldn't grow rice. Buckwheat thrives in poor, rocky soil at higher elevations, exactly the terrain that rice paddies can't use. In the mountainous regions of Japan, where rice cultivation was limited or impossible, buckwheat became the staple crop. Farmers ground it into flour and made a kind of thick paste or flatbread before noodle-making techniques arrived, and transformed it into the long, thin soba we recognize. By the Edo period, soba noodle stands were fixtures of city life. Common laborers could grab a bowl standing up, eat quickly, and get back to work. Soba was cheap, it was fast, and it turned out, significantly more nutritious than white rice, a fact that became medically significant when beriberi, caused by vitamin B1 deficiency from an all-white rice diet, became a serious problem in Edo, so serious it was nicknamed the Edo disease. The mountain farmers who couldn't afford fancy rice were, ironically, eating something healthier all along. There's a certain poetic justice in that. The aristocrats and city merchants eating their polished white rice were quietly developing a nutritional deficiency that the peasant eating buckwheat in the hills never had to worry about. History has a sense of humor, even when it's taking centuries to deliver the punchline. Dish 8, Hai Kayu, barnyard millet porridge. If barley porridge was the staple of much of peasant Japan, barnyard millet, hai, was what you ate when even the barley ran out, or when you lived in a region where barley didn't grow well. Hikayu, millet porridge, was considered the bottom of the grain hierarchy, the roughest and most austere of the coarse grains. The Tokugawa shoguns were quite explicit about this hierarchy. Official edicts from the Edo period instructed peasants to eat barley, wheat, millet, and radishes, and specifically noted that white rice was not appropriate for peasant consumption. Peasants were told in writing what they were and weren't allowed to eat, so eating hai wasn't just poverty, it was policy. Hiekayu had a slightly earthy, bland flavor. Cooked long enough, it turned silky. Flavored with miso, dried greens, or the occasional pickled vegetable, it became a meal. Generations of farm laborers ate it before dawn and went out to tend the very rice fields whose harvest they would never taste. There's something worth sitting with in that. In years of bad harvest, hai became the difference between life and starvation. During the Great Tenmei Famine, which began in 1782 and lasted until 1787 to 1788, and is considered one of the deadliest famines of the Edo period, northern regions of Japan suffered catastrophic crop failures. In those years, families who had stockpiled coarse grains like millet survived. Those who had depended entirely on rice had nothing to fall back on. The humble high, the grain that nobody wanted, quietly saved lives. Dish 7, umeboshi, pickled plums. Umeboshi deserves its own entry because, despite being one of the simplest preserved foods imaginable, a small plum, salted and dried, it carried an extraordinary amount of weight in feudal Japanese daily life. The plum is not sweet like Western plums. It's sour, intensely so, with a tartness that makes your jaw clench. When salted and dried in the sun, it becomes umeboshi, small, wrinkled, and almost shockingly salty and sour at once. Peasants tucked a single umeboshi into the center of a rice or grain ball to keep it from spoiling and to make the plain starch palatable. Soldiers carried umeboshi as a portable condiment and mild preservative. The samurai class ate them, but they appeared in peasant meals long before that. Umeboshi was already documented in Japan's earliest records as a food used in ceremonies, and its use spread down through every level of society until it landed in the packed lunch of a farmer's child on the way to the fields. The sourness made you salivate, which helped you digest the dry grain around it. Whether anyone understood that physiologically at the time is another question. They understood it worked. Dish 6, Konjac, devil's tongue jelly. Konjac is one of the stranger entries on this list. A dense, almost rubbery jelly made from the corm of the Konjac plant, sometimes called devil's tongue. It has almost no calories, almost no flavor on its own, and a texture that takes some getting used to. And yet it was a fixture of the Japanese poor man's table for centuries. The Konjac plant grows readily in Japanese mountain regions. Processing the corm into konjac requires boiling, drying, and mixing with water and a natural alkaline agent. The result is a firm, gelatinous block that absorbs whatever flavors it's cooked with: miso broth, soy sauce, dried fish stock. In that sense, it's an ideal extender. You add it to a stew, and suddenly there's more of the stew, even though you haven't added much of anything costly. Konjac appears in the records of feudal court kitchens, but it was common fare in peasant homes long before nobility paid it any attention. Buddhist monks made regular use of it in temple cuisine because it was plant-based and filling. For farming families, it was food that cost almost nothing and kept hunger at bay. In a pinch, that's everything. Dish 5, tofu, the bean curd of the masses. Tofu arrived in Japan from China, brought by Buddhist monks during the Nara and Heian periods, spanning the 8th through 12th centuries CE. The earliest written Japanese record of tofu dates to 1182 to 1183, when it was noted as an offering at Kasuga Shrine in Nara. For a long time, it stayed inside monastery walls, part of the Shojin Ryori vegetarian tradition. Eventually, it escaped those walls and became one of the most widely eaten foods in feudal Japan. For peasants, tofu was a rare and welcome source of protein. Making tofu required soybeans, water, and a coagulant, sea salt brine or nigari, a mineral-rich byproduct of sea salt production. Village tofu makers sold fresh blocks in the morning. You could also get it in the form of firm, dried, or deep-fried varieties that kept longer. Agadashi tofu, cubes of lightly battered, deep-fried tofu served in a light broth, became associated with townspeople and artisans in the Edo period, but its origins were more humble. Tofu in nearly any form was an affordable protein for people who couldn't afford fish every day and couldn't eat meat at all under Buddhist custom. There's a reason tofu remains central to Japanese cooking to this day. It worked then, and it works now. Dish 4, Nemono, simmered root vegetables. Nemono simply means simmered things, and for the peasants of feudal Japan, simmering was the most practical cooking technique available. You needed a clay pot, a fire, water, and whatever roots, tubers, and greens the season offered. That's it. Burdock root, taro, daikon radish, bamboo shoots, sweet potato turnips. These were the vegetables most accessible to ordinary rural households. They didn't require much to grow, they stored reasonably well, and long simmering with a bit of miso or soy sauce transformed them into something genuinely satisfying. The simmered dishes served in peasant households bore no resemblance to the elaborate Hanzen Ryori banquet cuisine of the nobility, with its lacquerware and careful presentations. Peasant nimono was cooked in a single pot over a fire, eaten quickly, and the pot put back on for tomorrow. But the technique itself, long, slow cooking in seasoned broth, is the foundation of some of Japan's most beloved comfort food today. There's no shortcut for time. The feudal farm kitchen understood that. Dish 3, iriko dashi, dried sardine broth. Before dashi became something made with carefully sourced kombu and premium katsuobushi, peasant households across coastal and rural Japan were making their broth from iriko, small dried sardines. You simply dropped a handful into cold water, let them soak, and then simmered them for a few minutes. What came out was a broth that was rich, a little briny, and deeply savory. Sardines were abundant along Japan's coastlines and relatively easy to dry and preserve. A bag of iriko cost very little and lasted a long time. That broth became the base for everything. Miso soup, simmered vegetables, simple porridges given an extra layer of flavor. The umami depth that dried sardines deliver is not subtle. It's a working-class flavor, honest and direct. Japanese coastal communities developed entire cooking vocabularies around this cheap, nutritious little fish. It wasn't considered refined. It wasn't supposed to be. It was the flavor of the water and the shore, available to anyone who lived near them. Inland peasants got dried sardines through trade and traveling merchants, who carried them wrapped in straw. Even far from the coast, iriko showed up in village kitchens because it was cheap, it didn't spoil, and it made a thin pot of simmered vegetables taste like something worth eating. When you have very little to cook with, the quality of your broth matters more than anything else. The people who figured that out first weren't professional chefs. They were farmers trying to make dinner taste like something. Dish 2, yakimo, roasted sweet potato. The sweet potato reached Japan from the Ryukyu Kingdom, present-day Okinawa, in the early 17th century and spread across the country with remarkable speed. By the mid-Edo period, roasted sweet potato vendors called yakimoya were a common sight on the streets of Edo and other towns, and the smell of sweet potatoes roasting over coals on a cold day became one of the defining sensory memories of common people's Japan. For rural peasants, the sweet potato was a lifesaver, literally. It grew in poor soils that other crops couldn't use. It produced a high yield, and it kept well through winter. During periods of famine, it was the crop that kept people alive. The Tokugawa government eventually recognized this and actively promoted sweet potato cultivation as a famine relief crop following the Kyoho famine of 1732. Roasted in hot ash or coals, yakimo required nothing else. No seasoning, no preparation, no equipment beyond a fire. The flesh turned sweet and soft, the skin charred and smoky. It was peasant food in the most direct sense, grown in the cheapest ground, cooked with nothing but heat. A vendor in Edo once reportedly called out, "Yaki imo, ishi yaki imo," stone-roasted sweet potato, and you could hear it echoing down the street. That call was the sound of the working city's stomach. The sweet potatoes spread across Japan is one of those rare stories where a foreign food arrived, got adopted immediately by the people who needed it most, and almost overnight became inseparable from daily life. Scholars of the Edo period noted that sweet potato cultivation in the Kanto region expanded dramatically after the Kyoho famine, as domain governments actively distributed seed stock to farming villages. By the late Edo period, it was grown in nearly every corner of the country. Not bad for a crop that wasn't even in Japan 150 years earlier. Dish 1. Kayamochi, reedgrass rice cake. The last dish on this list is perhaps the most forgotten. Kayamochi, sometimes called miscanthus or reedgrass rice cake, was a seasonal food made in villages where even plain white rice cakes were considered too fine for everyday use. Peasants would pack a small amount of pounded grain, often mixed with millet or barley flour, wrap it in dried reed grass leaves, and steam or boil the whole package over a fire. The reed grass leaves left a faint, clean, almost herbal impression on the outside of the cake. Inside, the dense grain was soft and slightly sticky. It wasn't sweet, it wasn't elaborate, it was portable. It required no utensils to eat, and it could be carried to the fields and eaten at midday without stopping work for long. Reed grass grew wild throughout rural Japan. Using it as a wrapping cost nothing. Kayamochi appeared at seasonal festivals and during planting and harvest periods when workers needed something they could carry and eat on the move. Over time, wealthier versions, wrapped in bamboo leaves, filled with sweet bean paste, became part of festival culture, while the original peasant version quietly disappeared from the record. Most people in Japan today wouldn't recognize kayamochi. That's exactly why it belongs on this list. And there you have it, 15 dishes that fed the backbone of feudal Japan. The farmers, the laborers, the people who grew the rice they weren't allowed to eat. What's remarkable, looking back, is that so many of these foods survived long past the world that made them. Miso, natto, soba, tsukemono, tofu, they're still on Japanese tables today. They just got cleaned up, refined, celebrated, given names in fancy restaurants, written up in food magazines. But somewhere underneath all of that, there's a woman stirring barley porridge in a clay pot at dawn, a farmer tucking an umeboshi into a grain ball before heading out to the fields, a village child eating a roasted sweet potato in the cold. That's where Japanese cuisine really started. Not in the palace kitchens, down here with the rest of them. The food of the poor has a habit of outlasting the rich. It's more honest. It doesn't have anywhere to be. If you found this as fascinating as we did, give this video a like. It genuinely helps the channel more than you might think. And if you want more deep dives into history, food, and the lives of ordinary people across time, subscribe and stick around. There's plenty more where this came from.